Harold and Martha Bennett were told they should be grateful, grateful that their children had found a solution, grateful that someone was willing to buy the lakeside home they had spent 41 years paying for, grateful that, at 78 and 75, they would no longer have to worry about stairs, repairs, or harsh winters by the water. At least, that was how their son explained it when he slid the papers across the kitchen table. The same table Harold had built with his own hands. The same table where birthdays had been celebrated, college acceptances had been announced, and family photographs had been spread out every Christmas. 3 weeks later, the house was gone. The new owners moved in before the autumn leaves had even finished falling, and Harold and Martha found themselves living out of a borrowed room above an auto repair shop. What hurt most wasn't losing the house. It was realizing that their children seemed relieved to see them leave. Then, on a cold county auction morning, Harold spent the last $7 he could justify wasting on something nobody else wanted: a collapsing boat dock at the far end of the lake. The roof sagged. The support posts leaned toward the water. Several boards were so rotten that birds nested beneath them. The auctioneer laughed when Harold raised his hand. Most of the crowd laughed, too. They said the old man had finally lost his mind. But 6 months later, some of those same people would stand speechless on those weathered planks, because hidden beneath the dock's wooden floor was something that had been concealed for decades: a forgotten canoe. And inside that canoe was a secret powerful enough to bring their children racing back to the lake for reasons that had nothing to do with love. Before we uncover what was hidden beneath that dock, take a moment to subscribe and stay with us. Stories like Harold and Martha's remind us that losing a home is not always the same as losing a future. And sometimes, the place everyone else abandons becomes the place where a life begins again. Long before anyone called them a burden, Harold and Martha Bennett had been the kind of couple people pointed to when they talked about commitment. They met beside the lake when they were barely out of high school. Martha was 18 and working part-time at the town library during the summer. Harold was 20, covered in sawdust most days, helping his uncle repair fishing boats along the shoreline. Their first conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Their second lasted nearly 3 hours. By autumn, they were inseparable. The lake became the backdrop of nearly every important moment in their lives. Their first date happened on a weathered dock. Their first argument happened in a rowboat drifting too far from shore. Their engagement took place beneath a cedar tree overlooking the water at sunset. Years later, when people asked why they never moved away, Martha always gave the same answer: some people spend their whole lives searching for where they belong. We found it early. Life was never easy. Harold joined the Navy and spent years working on marine engines and vessel systems. The work was demanding, but it taught him skills that stayed with him long after his service ended. He learned how to repair almost anything made of wood or steel. He learned patience. He learned how small failures became disasters when ignored. When he returned home, he built a career as a marine engineer at a regional shipyard. Martha built her own career among books. She became the head librarian of the town library and spent decades helping children discover stories, helping students complete research projects, and helping older residents navigate a world that seemed to change faster every year. Together, they lived modestly. There were no luxury vacations, no expensive cars, no grand displays of wealth. Every spare dollar went into a dream they shared: a house beside the lake. For years, they saved carefully. Harold worked overtime shifts. Martha picked up additional responsibilities at the library. Eventually, they purchased a small piece of land overlooking the water. The house that stood there later wasn't built by contractors alone. Harold spent countless evenings helping frame walls, install windows, and finish details. Even decades later, he could point to individual boards and remember exactly where they came from. That house became far more than a structure. It became the center of their lives. Their son Daniel took his first steps in the living room. Their daughter Rebecca learned to swim in the lake behind the property. Every birthday, holiday, graduation party, and family gathering seemed to happen within those walls. Whenever storms swept across the lake, Harold would sit on the porch and watch the waves roll toward shore. Martha often sat beside him with a blanket and a book. Those quiet evenings became their favorite tradition. As the years passed, their children grew up and left. The house became quieter, then quieter still, but neither Harold nor Martha minded. For them, silence wasn't loneliness. It was peace earned after decades of responsibility. Retirement arrived gradually. Harold spent more time repairing old boats for neighbors. Martha volunteered at historical archives and helped preserve local records. It was during those volunteer years that she became fascinated by forgotten stories surrounding the lake. The area carried more history than most people realized. Shipwrecks, fishing camps, old families, lost businesses, strange disappearances. Among those stories was one that always seemed incomplete. A story about a handmade canoe that had vanished nearly 50 years earlier. Different people told different versions. Some claimed it belonged to a conservation group. Others believed it had been built by a local craftsman known for documenting the history of the lake. A few insisted the canoe disappeared shortly before a financial scandal that quietly vanished from public conversation. Nobody seemed to know the truth. Most people dismissed the tale as small-town folklore. Yet Harold remembered hearing older fishermen discuss it when he was young. Whenever the topic surfaced, conversations tended to end abruptly. Someone would change the subject. Someone would laugh. Someone would say the story wasn't worth revisiting. That alone made Harold curious. Not obsessed, just curious. The kind of curiosity that lingers quietly for years. Neither he nor Martha could have imagined that decades later, that forgotten story would return to their lives, or that it would arrive only after everything they loved seemed to have been taken away. At the time, however, none of that mattered. The lake was calm. Their home was still theirs. Their family appeared intact. And on warm evenings, as sunlight danced across the water, Harold often believed he knew exactly how the rest of his life would unfold. He was wrong. The first signs appeared so gradually that Harold almost missed them. At first, it was just suggestions. Daniel would mention how difficult winter maintenance must be for two people in their 70s. Karen would point out news stories about elderly homeowners falling on icy steps. Their daughter, Rebecca, who lived 3 states away, started calling more often and asking questions about medications, doctor's appointments, and emergency plans. None of it seemed unreasonable. In fact, it sounded exactly like the kind of concern loving children should have. That was why the trap worked. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel arrived carrying coffee and a stack of brochures. Retirement communities, senior apartments, assisted living options. Harold barely glanced at them. "We're not moving," he said. Daniel smiled. "We're just talking." But the conversations never stopped. Every family dinner somehow circled back to the same subject. Safety, practicality, responsibility, future planning. The words changed. The message didn't. "You shouldn't be here anymore." Martha noticed it before Harold did. One evening, she stood at the kitchen sink, watching the lake turn silver beneath the moonlight. "Do you ever feel like they're talking about us as if we're already gone?" she asked quietly. Harold didn't answer immediately, because he had started noticing it too. The way decisions were discussed without them. The way concerns became assumptions. The way advice slowly transformed into pressure. A few weeks later, Daniel offered to help manage their finances. Harold declined. Then Daniel offered to help organize legal documents. Harold declined again. Then came the doctor appointment. The appointment that changed everything. Daniel insisted on driving. He sat in the examination room. He answered questions that had not been directed toward him. And afterward, he focused only on one sentence the doctor had casually mentioned. "At your age, unexpected health events become more common." The doctor had not recommended moving. The doctor had not suggested selling the house. But Daniel acted as if he had. Within a month, conversations became arguments. For the first time in 48 years of marriage, Martha began losing sleep. She woke up in the middle of the night and sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, staring at the dark water. The lake remained calm. Everything else felt uncertain. Then came the meeting. Daniel called it a family discussion. Harold later called it an ambush. Rebecca flew in. Karen brought printed documents. A financial advisor joined through video call. Nobody had warned Harold and Martha beforehand. By the time they sat down at the dining table, everyone else already seemed to know the plan. Daniel spoke first. "We love you." Harold immediately disliked the direction of the conversation. "We're worried." Karen nodded. "The house is becoming too much." Rebecca looked uncomfortable, but remained silent. Then Daniel placed several papers on the table. Property valuations, market analysis, projected maintenance costs, insurance estimates. One document stood out. A preliminary home sale proposal. Harold stared at it. For several seconds he couldn't process what he was seeing. You've already talked to a realtor. Daniel hesitated. That hesitation told Harold everything. The conversations had been happening behind closed doors. Without him, without Martha. For months. We were exploring options, Daniel said carefully. Harold pushed the papers away. No. The room fell silent. Daniel looked frustrated. Karen looked prepared, as if she had rehearsed this moment. Dad, you have to think realistically. I am thinking realistically. No, you're thinking emotionally. Harold laughed once. A sharp, humorless sound. Of course, I'm thinking emotionally. It's my home. Nobody responded. And somehow that hurt even more. Because not one person disagreed. Not one person said he had a right to feel attached. To them, the attachment itself seemed to be the problem. The discussions continued for weeks. Every refusal created more pressure. Every objection became evidence that Harold was being stubborn. The situation worsened after a storm damaged part of the dock behind the house. The repairs weren't even severe. Harold could have fixed them himself. But Daniel used photographs of the damage as proof. Proof that the property had become dangerous. Proof that change was necessary. Proof that his parents could no longer manage on their own. Then came the moment Martha would later remember most clearly. Not because it was dramatic, because it was quiet. She walked into Daniel's kitchen one afternoon while visiting for lunch. Karen and Daniel were speaking in the next room. They didn't know she could hear them. The property value has gone up almost 40%. Karen's voice. We can't let them sit on it forever. A pause. Then Daniel. I know. The words lasted only a second, but they shattered something inside her. Because for the first time, the conversation wasn't about safety. It wasn't about concern. It wasn't about health. It was about value, money, opportunity, and asset. She never told Harold immediately. She wanted to believe she had misunderstood. But deep down, she knew she hadn't. The pressure intensified. Lawyers became involved. Financial planners appeared. Meetings multiplied. Eventually, exhaustion did what persuasion could not. Not because Harold changed his mind, because fighting every day became impossible. The paperwork was signed on a rainy Thursday morning. Harold remembered the sound of the pen more than anything else. The scratching noise across paper. 41 years reduced to a signature. Daniel looked relieved. Karen looked satisfied. Rebecca cried quietly. Martha stared out the window. Nobody celebrated. Nobody should have. 3 weeks later, a moving truck arrived. Harold packed his tools himself. Each one carried a memory. Each one felt heavier than it should. The last thing he removed from the house was an old wooden plaque hanging near the front door. It simply read, "Welcome home." He turned it over in his hands before placing it in a box. The irony was almost unbearable. When the buyers arrived, they seemed excited. Young, optimistic, ready to start a new chapter. Harold couldn't resent them. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were simply inheriting a dream someone else had lost. The drive away from the property lasted less than 10 minutes. It felt like crossing an ocean. Martha didn't cry. Neither did Harold. Grief had moved beyond tears. It settled somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter. For the next several weeks, they lived above an auto repair shop owned by one of Harold's former co-workers. The room was clean. The owner was kind. But every morning, Harold woke up expecting to hear waves against the shoreline. Instead, he heard traffic, metal tools, engines. One evening, he sat alone on a folding chair outside the building. The sunset painted the horizon gold. For a moment, he imagined the lake. The smell of water. The sound of wind through reeds. The old fishing boats. And then he remembered something. A place. A structure. A forgotten piece of shoreline most people avoided. An abandoned boat dock near the northern edge of the lake. He hadn't thought about it in years. Nobody wanted it. Nobody cared about it. Most people probably assumed it would eventually collapse into the water. Yet the memory refused to leave. The more he thought about it, the stronger the feeling became. Not hope. Not yet. Just a quiet pull. As though the lake itself was refusing to let go of him completely. 3 days later, Harold learned that the abandoned dock was scheduled for a county auction. And for the first time since losing his home, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. A reason to get out of bed before sunrise. The county auction attracted exactly the kind of crowd Harold expected. Investors, property speculators, curious retirees, people looking for bargains, and people who simply enjoyed watching others make mistakes. The auction was held in a small community building near the courthouse. Rows of folding chairs filled the room. Coffee steamed from paper cups. Conversations bounced between property values and local gossip. Harold sat quietly beside Martha near the back. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't have a plan beyond showing up. They certainly didn't have money to compete with serious buyers. The small savings they still possessed were being guarded carefully. Every dollar mattered now. When the auction began, most properties received at least some attention. Vacant lots, storage sheds, tax default parcels, a few old cabins. Bidding moved quickly. Numbers rose. Hands lifted. People nodded. Then, the auctioneer reached item 23. The abandoned North Dock. A photograph appeared on a screen. Several people laughed immediately. The image looked worse than Harold remembered. The roof sagged sharply toward the lake. Sections of railing were missing. Part of the platform appeared tilted. Years of neglect had left the structure gray and tired. It looked less like a dock and more like something waiting to collapse. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Opening bid. $7. Nobody moved. A few people exchanged amused glances. The silence stretched for several seconds. $7? Still nothing. Then Harold raised his hand. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Not cruel laughter. The kind reserved for someone making an obviously foolish decision. $7, the auctioneer confirmed. He looked around. Any other bids? None came. The gavel struck. Sold. Just like that, Harold Bennett became the owner of a rotting boat dock. For $7. Outside the building, reactions arrived quickly. Most people couldn't understand why anyone would want it. Others assumed grief had affected Harold's judgment. One man jokingly offered to buy it from him for $6 so he wouldn't lose too much money. Harold smiled politely. Martha smiled too. Neither bothered explaining. The truth was they didn't fully understand the decision themselves. They only knew the alternative. The alternative was waiting quietly for life to shrink. Neither of them was ready for that. 3 days later, they visited the property together. The drive north followed a winding shoreline road lined with old pine trees. The farther they traveled, the fewer houses appeared. Eventually, the pavement narrowed. Then the dock emerged through the trees. For a moment, neither spoke. The photographs had been accurate. If anything, they had been generous. The structure looked exhausted. Weather had stripped color from every visible surface. The roof carried scars from years of storms. Weeds pushed through cracks. Several support beams leaned at angles that inspired little confidence. Yet beyond the damage stretched the lake. Wide, open, alive. The water shimmered beneath autumn sunlight. Martha took a slow breath. For the first time since leaving their house, she smelled the lake again. Not through memory, not through longing. For real. Harold noticed tears gathering in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away. Not from sadness this time. Relief. A small piece of home had returned. They spent the afternoon walking carefully across the structure. Every board seemed to creak. Every step demanded caution. Yet the dock remained standing. Stubbornly, much like the two people exploring it. As they worked through the damage, a pickup truck rolled into the gravel clearing nearby. A man stepped out carrying a toolbox. Mid-30s. Broad shoulders. Friendly face. He waved. "You must be the new owners." Harold nodded. The man introduced himself as Jake Moreno. He owned a hardware and supply store a few miles away. Jake had heard about the auction. Like everyone else. Unlike everyone else, he hadn't come to laugh. "My father used to fish here," Jake said. "Back when the dock still mattered." The phrase lingered. Back when the dock still mattered. Harold glanced across the weathered structure. He understood the feeling. People had said similar things about older workers, older neighborhoods, older traditions, and sometimes older people. Jake spent nearly an hour showing them areas that needed immediate attention. Loose supports, unsafe sections, water damage, potential repair options. Before leaving, he handed Harold a folded piece of paper, a list of materials. Some items had prices. Others had been crossed out. "What happened here?" Martha asked. Jake looked toward the water. "My grandfather used to say this place had stories." "What kind of stories?" Jake shrugged. "The kind older people remember and younger people forget." Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away. The comment stayed with Harold long after the dust settled. During the following weeks, he and Martha visited the dock almost daily. Not because they had enough money to repair everything, because working there felt better than sitting still. Harold repaired what he could. He replaced loose fasteners, reinforced weak boards, cleared debris. Martha cleaned windows and removed years of accumulated trash. Slowly, the dock began looking less abandoned. Not restored. Not yet, but alive. Word spread through town. People noticed. Some admired their determination. Others remained skeptical. One local social media page posted photographs. The comments varied. A few wished them well. Many questioned their sanity. One comment received dozens of likes. Imagine losing a lake house and replacing it with that. Martha saw it accidentally. She never mentioned it to Harold, but she remembered it, because it perfectly captured how people viewed them. Not rebuilding, downgrading, not adapting, failing. Yet none of those people stood beside the lake each evening. None of them felt what Harold and Martha felt. The dock gave them purpose. Purpose had become rare. One chilly afternoon, while inspecting the far end of the platform, Harold met an elderly fisherman named Walter Briggs. Walter had spent nearly his entire life on the lake. He leaned heavily on a cane, but still visited the shoreline whenever weather allowed. The two men talked for nearly an hour. Eventually, Walter glanced toward the dock and smiled faintly. "You know what people used to call this place?" Harold shook his head. "The Hidden Harbor." The name immediately caught his attention. "Why?" Walter looked toward the water. "Because things had a habit of disappearing here." Harold laughed. "Boats?" "Sometimes." Walter's expression remained serious. "Stories, too." The answer surprised him. "What do you mean?" Walter tapped the end of his cane against the dock. "My father talked about a canoe once." Harold felt something stir inside him. The old story, the one he remembered from decades ago. Walter continued. "Said it vanished after some important people got nervous." "Nervous about what?" Walter shook his head. "Never told me." A gust of wind swept across the lake. The old fisherman started walking away. Then he stopped. Without turning around, he spoke one final sentence. "My father always believed the canoe was closer than people thought." Harold watched him disappear down the shoreline path. That evening, he couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. Closer than people thought. The words followed him home, followed him through dinner, followed him into sleep, and 3 days later, while examining an unusual section of floorboards near the center of the dock, he noticed something strange. One group of planks looked different from the others. The wood wasn't newer. It was older, but the nails didn't match. Someone had removed those boards once, and then carefully put them back. Harold crouched beside them, running his fingers across the surface, studying every detail. The engineer in him recognized patterns. The builder in him recognized intention. And for the first time since buying the dock, he began to wonder whether the stories had been true after all. That night, Harold did not tell Martha immediately about the mismatched nails. Not because he wanted to keep secrets from her, because a strange patch of floorboards was not proof of anything yet. They had already lost too much to build hope on rumors. The next morning, they arrived before sunrise with coffee, biscuits, a toolbox, 2 tarps, and 1 borrowed lantern. Mist moved across the lake in pale ribbons, wrapping itself around the posts beneath the dock. The water was quiet, but the structure answered every step with a tired wooden complaint. Their first goal was not beauty. It was safety. The dock had a small enclosed room near the shore end, once used as a bait office. The door hung crookedly. The windows were cracked. The floor smelled of damp rope, old fish, and rain trapped in wood. Still, it had 4 walls, a roof, and a view of the lake. For Harold and Martha, that was enough to begin. Harold fixed the door first. He removed the rusted hinge, packed the stripped holes with small slivers of wood, and set the screws again. His fingers moved slower than they once had, but the knowledge in them had not weakened. Martha watched from the doorway, noticing the swollen knuckles, the careful grip, the patience that had built boats, repaired engines, and held their family together for decades. When the door finally swung without scraping the floor, Martha tested it twice. Then she smiled. It was only a door, but after weeks of feeling pushed from one place to another, a door that opened and closed because Harold had fixed it felt like a victory. By noon, they had cleared out dead leaves, broken glass, fishing line, empty cans, and a nest of old newspaper packed into one corner by mice. Martha scrubbed the windows until the morning light could enter cleanly. Harold patched a small hole near the roofline with scrap plywood Jake Moreno had sold them for almost nothing. They worked slowly. They rested often. Harold's back stiffened whenever he bent too long. Martha's knees ached each time she stood from the floor. But neither complained much. Pain from work felt different from pain caused by betrayal. Work gave pain a purpose. In the afternoon, Jake returned with a coil of rope, a box of used hardware, and a portable battery lamp. "I found these in the back room," he said. Harold reached for his wallet. Jake shook his head. "A dock isn't alive until somebody ties a rope to it. My father used to say that." Martha accepted the rope with both hands. "Then we'd better make it alive again." Jake stayed long enough to help brace one weak railing. He did not take the tools from Harold. He did not speak to him as if age had made him helpless. He simply held boards steady, listened, and followed Harold's instructions. That mattered. Daniel had made Harold feel managed. Jake made him feel useful. By evening, a warm square of light glowed inside the little bait office. Martha stood outside and looked at it through the cleaned window. The room still leaned. The roof still needed work. The floor still creaked, but the light changed the feeling of the place. A light in a forgotten building was not much. Unless you had been forgotten too. They ate canned soup from paper bowls while sitting on overturned crates. A cold wind moved across the water, rattling the loose edge of a tarp. When the wind lifted a napkin from Harold's lap, he caught it with the seriousness of a man saving an important document. Martha laughed. The sound surprised them both. Harold looked at her across the crate. "There you are," he said. The first night tested them. By 10 o'clock, the temperature dropped sharply. Wind found every gap in the wall. The lake knocked against the posts beneath them with a hollow rhythm that made the floor seem thinner in the dark. They spread an old mattress pad on the driest section of the bait office and layered it with sleeping bags and blankets. Martha placed their wooden welcome home plaque against the wall beside their boxes, but she did not hang it. Not yet. The word home still felt too tender. Near midnight, rain began. At first, it was only a tapping overhead. Then it became a steady drumming. Within minutes, water revealed every weakness the roof had hidden in daylight. A drip formed above the back wall. Another appeared near the window. A thin stream ran down one corner and spread across the floor. Harold sat up immediately. Martha grabbed the lantern. Together, they moved boxes away from the water. Harold climbed onto a crate and pressed a tarp against the leaking corner, while Martha shoved a bucket under the worst drip. Rain hammered the roof. Wind pushed against the walls. The dock groaned as waves slapped the posts below. For one moment, Martha wondered if everyone had been right. Maybe the dock was too damaged. Maybe they were too old. Maybe wanting one more chance was foolishness. Then Harold climbed down, soaked through the shoulders, and pointed to the bucket. "At least now we know where the worst leak is." Martha stared at him. Then she shook her head and almost smiled. Only Harold could turn a miserable roof into useful information. By morning, the storm had passed. The dock still stood. So did they. Pale sunlight spread across the lake, turning the wet boards silver. Harold stepped outside stiffly, and Martha followed with coffee. They drank in silence, watching steam rise from their cups. The silence was not empty. It was proof. Later that morning, Harold inspected the floor for water damage. That was when he returned to the odd section near the center of the dock. The rain had made the difference clearer. Water had gathered along the seams of those boards in a near-perfect rectangle. The pattern was too clean to be accidental. Harold knelt. Martha noticed the change in his posture. "What is it?" He brushed dirt from one nailhead. "These don't match." "The boards?" "The nails." He pointed to the surrounding floor. Most of the dock was fastened with old galvanized square-head nails. "These are newer. Different spacing, too." Martha crouched beside him. "You think someone repaired this section?" Harold tapped one board with the handle of his screwdriver. The sound beneath was faintly hollow. "No," he said. "I think someone opened it." Martha's face changed. Not fear. Recognition. "The canoe," she whispered. Harold ran his fingers along the edge of the rectangle and found a narrow line beneath layers of grime and paint. Too straight to be a crack, too deliberate to be damage. A hidden hatch, or what remained of one. For a few seconds, the lake wind moved around them, carrying the smell of wet cedar and cold water. The dock no longer felt empty. It felt as if it had been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Harold reached for his pry bar. Martha placed a hand on his wrist. "Not yet." He looked at her. The old librarian was back in her eyes. "If this is something real, we document it. We photograph it, and we make sure someone else sees it before we open anything." Harold lowered the tool. She was right. They had lost their home partly because others had controlled the papers, the meetings, and the story. They would not make that mistake again. By sunset, Harold covered the marked section with a tarp and weighed the corners down with bricks. The little lamp glowed in the bait office window. The Welcome Home plaque still leaned against the wall, waiting. And beneath the center of the dock, under mismatched nails and sealed boards, something waited in the dark. Something hidden long before Harold and Martha lost their house. Something that might explain why the place had been forgotten, and why someone had wanted it to stay that way. By 8 the next morning, Martha had already made a list. Not a long one, just the kind of list a librarian made when something needed to be handled carefully. Photograph the floor, record the date, write down the names of witnesses, open nothing until every step had been seen by someone other than themselves. Harold teased her as she taped the sheet to the bait office wall. "You know," he said, "most people just pull up the boards." Martha clicked the pen shut. "Most people lose important things." He did not argue. They had learned that lesson the hardest way. Jake arrived first, carrying a camera, a crowbar, and 2 pairs of gloves. Walter Briggs came half an hour later in an old brown coat, leaning on his cane. When Harold offered his arm, Walter waved him off. "If your floor is hiding what I think it is," Walter said, "I'd like to arrive under my own power." Jake photographed the marked rectangle, the mismatched nails, and the seams darkened by rainwater. Harold placed a ruler beside the boards for scale. Martha wrote down the time. Only after everything had been recorded did Harold kneel with the pry bar. His hands were calm. Not because he felt calm, because age had taught him that trembling hands and old wood were a bad combination. The first nail resisted, then gave. Harold worked slowly along the edge of the rectangle, 1 nail at a time, 1 board at a time. Jake crouched nearby with a flashlight, careful not to interfere. When the first plank lifted free, the smell rose immediately. Cold mud, old cedar, trapped lake air. Beneath the boards was not open water, as Harold had expected. Instead, there was a sealed space framed between the dock supports, hidden above the waterline and protected by crossbeams. Someone had built a compartment. Deliberately, Harold removed the second board. Then the third. By the time the fourth came loose, Jake whispered something under his breath. There, beneath the floor, lay the curved wooden side of a canoe. For several seconds, nobody moved. It was wedged carefully inside the cavity, wrapped in rotting canvas and tied with rope blackened by age. Only part of the hull was visible, but Harold knew fine work when he saw it. Even covered in grime, the canoe had grace. The curve of the bow was clean. The ribs were narrow and precise. Walter removed his cap. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess my father wasn't telling stories after all." Martha lowered herself beside Harold. "The canoe," she said. Harold studied the way it had been placed, the supports beneath it, the careful padding along one side. "This wasn't thrown in here," he said. Jake looked at him. "Someone stored it?" "No." Harold leaned closer. "Someone protected it." They widened the opening carefully. Jake helped loosen the boards while Harold directed each movement. He refused to rush. The canoe had waited decades. It could wait another hour. When enough floor had been removed, they found old canvas straps secured to small iron hooks inside the hidden compartment. Harold cut the first strap. It broke apart more than it cut. Together, he and Jake eased the canoe upward, inch by inch. It was lighter than it looked, but fragile. Martha spread a tarp across the dock, and they placed it there as gently as if laying down a sleeping child. In full light, the canoe seemed even more remarkable. Its cedar strips had darkened with age, but the craftsmanship remained unmistakable. Near the bow, beneath layers of dirt, Harold noticed a small brass plate. He wiped it with his sleeve. 3 words appeared. "Callaway Lake Trust." Martha stopped writing. Walter's face tightened. Harold looked from one to the other. "You know that name?" Martha answered first. "I've seen it in old archive boxes, conservation records, land access documents. Nothing recent." Walter's voice became rough. "People stopped saying that name after the trouble." "What trouble?" Jake asked. Walter pointed to the canoe. "There should be something inside." Harold moved to the center seat. Beneath it, tucked into a space most people would never notice, was a metal box the size of a loaf of bread. It had been strapped underneath with wire and sealed in waxed cloth. Martha took 1 step back. Jake photographed the box before anyone touched it. Then Harold clipped the old wire and lifted it free. The box was dented and green with corrosion around the corners, but intact. On the lid, someone had scratched a sentence into the metal. "If I do not return, give this to Ruth." No last name. No explanation. Just that. The dock seemed to go quieter around them. Harold tried the latch. It refused to move. Jake offered a small screwdriver. Harold worked the edge with patience, easing away corrosion bit by bit. When the latch finally snapped open, Martha flinched. Inside were oilcloth packets, a rolled map, and a small leather journal sealed inside a brittle plastic sleeve. No gold, no yavels, no stack of cash. Yet Harold understood at once that what they had found was more dangerous than money. Martha unfolded the first packet. Inside were copied ledger pages, old receipts, and several typed letters dated from the early 1970s. She recognized the format: municipal records, donation receipts, land purchase agreements. The second packet contained newspaper clippings about a lakeside conservation campaign that had promised public access, protected shoreline, and a youth boating program. The campaign had vanished before Martha began working at the library. She had always assumed it failed from lack of funding. The map changed that assumption. It showed the northern shoreline in careful hand-drawn detail. Several parcels were circled in blue ink. The old dock was marked with a small anchor symbol. Beside it, someone had written, "Hidden harbor safe until hearing." Martha read the words twice. "Hearing," she whispered. Harold looked at Walter. The old fisherman's eyes had gone wet. "My father said there was supposed to be a public hearing," Walter said. Then a man disappeared, the papers vanished, and the whole matter died. "What man?" Jake asked. Walter swallowed. "Elias Calloway." Martha looked back at the brass plate. "Calloway Lake Trust." Harold opened the leather journal last. The first pages were filled with neat handwriting. Weather notes, water levels, names of donors, children learning to paddle near the North Shore. Then the tone changed. Entries became shorter, more urgent. Money missing from accounts. Pressure from council members. A land developer offering private deals. A warning that certain people wanted the shoreline closed, not protected. Harold turned one page and found a sentence underlined 3 times. "If they take the house records, they will not think to search the canoe." No one spoke. The meaning settled slowly. The canoe had not been hidden because it was valuable. It had been hidden because it carried proof. Martha held the journal with the care of someone holding a voice that had almost been erased. For the first time since their own home had been taken, she felt anger sharpen into something useful. Not revenge. Evidence. Jake broke the silence first. "What do we do now?" Martha closed the journal carefully. "We make copies." Harold nodded. "And we find out who Ruth was." Walter gripped his cane and stared at the canoe. "I can tell you one thing," he said. They turned to him. "My father always believed Elias Calloway didn't leave this lake willingly." A cold wind moved across the dock. The tarp fluttered beside the open floor. Harold looked at the canoe resting in the light after all those years in darkness. The dock had given them shelter. Now it had given them a mystery. And maybe, if they were careful, it would give them something stronger. A way to prove that forgotten things were not always gone. Sometimes they were waiting for the right hands to bring them back. The first person outside their small circle to see the canoe was not a reporter, a lawyer, or a town official. It was a girl sleeping in a van near the closed fish cleaning station. Martha noticed the vehicle on the 3rd morning after the discovery. An old blue van sat half hidden behind a stand of pines, its back windows covered with cardboard. At first, she assumed it belonged to a fisherman who had stayed out too late. Then she saw breath fogging the inside of the windshield. Someone was sleeping there. Harold wanted to approach carefully. Martha insisted on bringing food. They walked over with 2 cups of coffee, wrapped biscuits, and the cautious kindness of people who knew how easily help could feel like humiliation. The girl opened the door only a few inches. She looked 19, maybe 20. Thin face. Dark hair tucked under a gray knit cap. A backpack rested behind her like a pillow. "We're not here to bother you," Martha said. "Just thought you might be cold." The girl hesitated. Her name was Lily Carter. She said she was passing through. Then, she admitted she had been passing through for 11 days. Her family lived 2 counties away. Things had gone badly after her stepfather told her she was old enough to figure life out. She had worked at a grocery store until the manager cut her hours. Then the van became her bedroom. Martha listened without interrupting. She never rushed shame. She let it set itself down first. "You can warm up at the dock," Martha said. Lily looked past them toward the old building. "That place?" Harold smiled faintly. "It's better on the inside than it looks." That was not entirely true, but it was becoming truer every day. Lily followed them at a distance, ready to run if kindness became something else. Inside the bait office, the battery lamp glowed on a crate. The Welcome Home plaque still leaned against the wall. A pot of oatmeal simmered on the camping stove. Lily ate like someone trying not to appear hungry. Martha pretended not to notice. Harold stepped outside and found Jake unloading supplies from his truck. He had brought plywood, insulation scraps, and a second-hand space heater he claimed had been taking up room. When he saw Lily through the window, he lowered his voice. "Everything okay?" "Not yet," Harold said. "But maybe starting." By noon, Lily had stopped watching the door. By afternoon, she was helping Martha sort boxes. She did not ask about the open section of floor at first. But curiosity finally won when she saw the cedar canoe resting under a tarp near the wall. "Is that yours?" Harold looked at Martha before answering. "We found it. Under the dock," Martha added. Lily stared as if deciding whether adults were always this strange or only after 75. Instead of explaining everything, Martha showed her one photograph from the metal box. Children in life jackets standing near the north shore, holding paddles beside a younger man with serious eyes and rolled-up sleeves. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Elias with the first summer class." Ruth took this. Lily studied the picture. "Who are they?" "That's what we're trying to find out," Martha said. The question gave the day shape. While Harold and Jake worked on making the dock safer, Martha turned the bait office into a research room. She spread copied ledger pages across a folding table, labeled envelopes, and compared names from the journal to old clippings from the town archive. Lily watched for a while. Then she picked up a pencil. "My school made us do genealogy projects," she said. "I know how to search old names online if you have internet." They did not have internet at the dock. Jake did. By evening, his hardware store's back office had become their second command center. Martha, Lily, and Jake sat around an old computer while Harold reviewed scanned photographs from the canoe. They searched for Elias Calloway. The results were thin, too thin. There were old mentions of the Callaway Lake Trust in 1971 and 1972. A short article about a planned public boating program. A donation drive. A notice for a hearing about protected shoreline access. Then almost nothing. No obituary for Elias. No follow-up article. No explanation for why the trust disappeared. Martha wrote the gaps down carefully. Lily leaned closer to the screen. "Try Ruth with the trust name." Martha did. Several results appeared under a different last name. Ruth Calloway Ellison. A marriage record. A teaching certificate. Then a newspaper clipping from 28 years earlier. Local teacher retires after 4 decades. The photograph showed an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a gentle mouth. Before teaching, Ruth had helped organize youth education programs around Callaway Lake. Lily pointed to the date. She might still be alive. Then Jake found a current phone listing for a Ruth Ellison at a senior apartment complex in Millbridge. Harold stood behind Martha's chair, one hand resting on its back. "Don't call tonight," he said. Martha looked up. "Why?" "Because if she has waited 50 years to hear about that canoe, she deserves morning light." The next day, Martha made the call from Jake's office. She used her library voice. Clear, polite, steady. When Ruth Ellison answered, her voice was thin but alert. Martha explained only enough. The old North Dock, a canoe, a metal box, Elias Calloway's journal. For several seconds, the line carried nothing but breath. Then Ruth said, "You found it." Martha closed her eyes. Yes. Ruth did not ask if they were mistaken. She did not ask for proof. She asked one question. Was the journal dry? Martha's hand tightened around the receiver. Yes. A sound came through the phone, small and broken. "Then Elias kept his promise," Ruth whispered. That afternoon, the dock changed. Not because of repairs. Because people began to gather there for reasons other than curiosity. Jake came after closing his store. Lily returned with a notebook and asked if she could stay one more night. Walter arrived with a thermos and 3 names of men who had served on the council in 1972. Even the retired auto shop owner who had given Harold and Martha a room stopped by with a box of extension cords. No one called it a community. Not yet. But that was what it was becoming. A small circle of people drawn to a place the town had written off. Harold noticed Lily standing outside near the rail just before sunset. She was watching the lake, arms folded tightly against the cold. He stepped beside her. "You don't have to leave tonight," he said. She kept her eyes on the water. "I don't want to be another problem." Harold thought of Daniel saying the house was becoming too much, Karen saying the practical thing. The way concern could disguise removal. "People aren't problems just because they need a place to stand," he said. Lily wiped her cheek with her sleeve and nodded once. Inside, Martha lifted the Welcome Home plaque from the floor and handed it to Lily. "Would you mind hanging this by the door?" Lily looked startled. "May? You have steadier knees than we do." It was a practical excuse. Everyone knew it. Lily took the plaque, found 2 nails, and fixed it beside the entrance to the bait office. The words looked different there than they had in the old lake house. Less like a memory, more like a decision. That night, 4 people ate soup at the dock instead of 2. The lamp burned brighter because Jake had brought a better battery. The canoe rested under its tarp, no longer buried. And on Martha's table, beside the copied journal pages, sat a new note written in her careful hand. "Call Ruth Ellison again. Ask what happened before the hearing." For the first time, Harold understood that finding the canoe was not the end of the mystery. It was the beginning of responsibility. Whatever Elias Calloway had tried to protect had survived wood, water, silence, and time. Now it had found its way to them, and the old dock, once mocked as a $7 mistake, had become something none of them expected. A shelter, a witness, a harbor for people who had nowhere else to be believed. By the end of the second week, the dock no longer looked abandoned. It still looked old. It still leaned in places. There were still repairs waiting in every corner. But old and abandoned were not the same thing. Old carried memory. Abandoned carried surrender. Harold refused to surrender. Each morning, he marked one task on a chalkboard Jake had brought from the back of the hardware store. Replace west railing, seal window frame, sort documents, photograph canoe, call Ruth, check shoreline deeds. The list made the work feel possible. Not small, posible. Lily became the fastest worker among them. She painted primer over repaired boards, carried supplies, labeled boxes for Martha, and learned how to sand cedar without ruining the grain. Harold taught her to listen to wood before cutting it. "Wood tells you where it wants to split," he said. Lily looked at the old plank in her hands. "People do that too." Harold did not answer quickly. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said, "they do." Martha noticed how Lily stayed near the doorway whenever visitors came. The girl still expected welcome to be temporary, so Martha gave her responsibilities no guest would receive. A key to the bait office. A shelf for her notebook. Her name written on the task board, not as Charity, as belonging. Meanwhile, Ruth Ellison became the voice from the past. She was too frail to visit immediately, but she spoke with Martha every morning by phone. Her memories arrived in pieces. Elias had been her older brother, a boat builder, conservationist, and stubborn believer that the lake should belong to more than wealthy families with private docks. He had started the Callaway Lake Trust to protect public shoreline access and teach children boating skills for free. The canoe was his first teaching boat. Ruth had taken the photograph found in the box. He used to say, "A child who learns the water learns respect," Ruth told Martha. Respect for danger, respect for patience, respect for things bigger than themselves. Martha wrote every word. Then Ruth's voice hardened. The trouble began when the North Shore became valuable. Developers wanted private lakefront lots. Certain council members wanted campaign donations. A banker named Leonard Voss had promised to manage trust funds until the public hearing. According to Ruth, Elias discovered that donated money and land option payments had been moved through accounts he had never approved. He was going to expose them at the hearing, Ruth said, but he disappeared before it happened. Yes. Martha stopped writing for a moment. What did the town say? That he left. That he was unstable. That the trust failed because he mismanaged it. And you believe that? Ruth's answer came sharp despite her age. Never. Those calls changed the mood at the dock. The mystery was no longer just about hidden papers. It was about a man whose name had been buried under lies. Martha began ordering copies of old deeds, meeting minutes, and archived newspaper notices. Jake drove to the county records office twice. Lily scanned documents at the public library, using a card Martha helped her replace. Harold focused on the canoe. He cleaned it slowly with soft cloth, warm water, and patience. Beneath the grime, the brass plate brightened. The cedar grain returned in thin golden lines. On the inside of the bow, he found initials burned into the wood. A. Che. Under them was a date, the 14th of June, 1972. Walter stood nearby when Harold uncovered it. "That was 3 days before the hearing," Walter said. The old man's voice shook. "My father was right." As the dock improved, people began stopping by. At first, they came with excuses. A neighbor brought extra screws. A retired teacher brought old photographs of the lake. A woman from the church dropped off blankets for Lily, pretending she had simply cleaned out a closet. Some came because they had heard about the canoe. Others came because they had heard Harold and Martha were making the place livable. A few came because they were lonely and did not know how to say so. Harold started leaving 2 extra chairs outside near the rail. Then 4, then 6. One Saturday afternoon, a boy named Mason arrived with his grandfather to see the canoe. Mason had trouble speaking to strangers, but he could not stop staring at the boat. Harold placed a piece of sandpaper in his hand and showed him how to smooth a scrap of cedar. The boy worked quietly for 20 minutes. When he left, he asked if he could come back. That evening, Martha looked around the little bait office. Lily was labeling file folders. Jake was repairing a lamp. Harold was cleaning cedar dust from his sleeves. Walter was telling Mason's grandfather a story about winter fishing in 1968. The room was crowded, imperfect, warm. Martha realized the dock was no longer only sheltering them. It was gathering people. The first outside attention came through a local history blog. The writer, a retired reporter named Nora Fields, had heard rumors about a discovered canoe tied to the old Callaway Trust. She arrived with a camera and a cautious expression. Martha almost refused the interview. Then she remembered what silence had done to Elias. She agreed on one condition. "No speculation," she said. "Only what we can document." Nora smiled. "That's the best kind of story." They showed her the canoe, the brass plate, photographs of the hidden compartment, and copies of public records. Martha did not show everything. Not yet. She had learned the value of keeping original evidence safe. 2 days later, the blog post appeared. The headline was simple: "Forgotten Canoe Raises Questions About Lost Lake Trust." By lunchtime, half the town had read it. By evening, Daniel had too. Harold knew because his phone rang 3 times in a row. He did not answer. Martha saw the name on the screen and placed the phone face down. Not out of cruelty, out of timing. They had spent months being forced to respond to other people's decisions. Now they would choose when to speak. The next morning brought a different kind of visitor. A black sedan stopped near the gravel clearing. A man in a dark coat stepped out, looked at the dock, then photographed the property from the road without introducing himself. Jake noticed first. Harold followed the man's gaze. Not to the dock, to the canoe visible through the cleaned window. The man left after less than 5 minutes. But the message remained. Someone outside their circle had become interested. That afternoon, Martha received one more packet from the county records office. Inside was a copy of an old account summary connected to the Callaway Lake Trust. She spread it across the table. The numbers looked ordinary at first. Then, Lily pointed to 3 repeated transfers. Same amount, same week, different recipient names. Jake leaned closer. "Are those companies?" Martha reached for another folder. "They look like companies." She placed an old newspaper clipping beside the account sheet. One of the recipient names matched a development firm connected to Leonard Voss, the banker Ruth had named. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Martha circled the transfers in red pencil. The stolen money was no longer just a memory. It had a trail. Harold stood beside the canoe, watching light move over its restored bow. A few weeks earlier, he had believed the dock might give them somewhere to survive. Now it had given them something else. A truth people had buried because it was inconvenient. And somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the road, beyond the lake houses with perfect windows and private gates, the people connected to that truth were beginning to notice. Daniel arrived on a Tuesday afternoon wearing the expression of a man who wanted to look concerned before anyone accused him of wanting something else. Karen came with him. So did a woman Harold had never met. She introduced herself as Denise Palmer, an attorney specializing in elder care and property risk. The phrase told Harold almost everything he needed to know. Martha was inside the bait office, sorting copies of the account records with Lily, when Daniel stepped onto the dock without asking permission. Mon? Dad? Harold was sanding the repaired rail near the water. He did not stop immediately. He finished the stroke, brushed cedar dust from his sleeve, and only then turned around. Daniel, his son's eyes moved over the dock, the new rope, the repaired rail, the cleaned windows, the extra chairs near the wall. Then his gaze found the canoe through the open bait office door. For one brief second, the concern disappeared. Hunger replaced it. Karen saw it too and stepped forward quickly. "We've been calling." Martha came to the doorway. "We saw." Daniel looked wounded by that answer, as if unanswered calls were worse than an unwanted sale. "We were worried." Harold placed the sandpaper on the rail. "You were curious." The attorney lifted a hand gently, practiced and calm. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, no one wants conflict. Your son contacted me because this situation raises serious concerns." "What situation?" Martha asked. Denise glanced at the floor, the patched roof, the open work table covered with labeled files. Two elderly adults living in an uninspected, partially damaged structure over water. Karen nodded. "Exactly. This is not safe." Lily stepped half behind the table. Harold noticed. So did Martha. A few months earlier, those words might have cornered them. Safety. Concern. Responsibility. The familiar vocabulary of control. This time, Martha reached for a folder. "We are not living here illegally," she said. "The structure is registered as a seasonal dock office. We are repairing it within the county's small structure allowance. We have receipts, photographs, and written notes for every repair." Denise blinked. She had expected emotion. She had received documentation. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Mom, this isn't about paperwork." "It usually is," Martha said. Karen's eyes moved to the canoe again. "And what about that? You found something historically significant under county-regulated shoreline property and didn't notify officials?" "We documented the discovery," Martha said. "We preserved it. We contacted Ruth Ellison, the closest known living relative connected to the Callaway Trust records." Daniel frowned. "Ruth who?" The name meant nothing to him. That somehow made Martha sadder than anger would have. Denise stepped closer to the bait office but did not enter. "The county may have a claim if the object was hidden within a structure attached to public water access." Jake's truck pulled into the gravel clearing before Harold could answer. He stepped out and took in the scene quickly. Attorney, Daniel, Karen, Martha's folders, Lily's pale face. Jake did not rush. He walked onto the dock with the steady calm of someone entering a room where a fire had not yet been named. "Afternoon," he said. Karen looked annoyed. "This is a family matter." Jake nodded toward the dock beneath their feet. "Funny. I sold half the bolts holding this family matter together." Harold almost smiled. Denise returned to her calm voice. "Mr. Bennett, no one is denying you've done some work here. But if this discovery has financial value, historical value, or legal relevance, it cannot simply remain in private hands." "There it is," Harold said. Daniel flushed. "Dad, don't do that." "Do what?" "Act like we're trying to steal from you." Harold looked at his son for a long time. He did not raise his voice. "Daniel, I watched you sell the house I built before the leaves had finished falling. I am done pretending your concern arrives with clean hands." The dock went quiet. Even the water below seemed to soften its knocking. Karen recovered first. "This is exactly why we came. You're becoming paranoid." Martha's face changed. Not dramatically, but enough for Lily to notice. The word had been chosen carefully. Paranoid, unreasonable, unsafe, too emotional. Those words had power when spoken around older people. They could turn grief into evidence. They could turn resistance into a symptom. Martha opened another folder. "If you are here to question our judgment, you should know I have already spoken with Dr. Mendel's office. Neither Harold nor I have been advised to surrender decision-making authority. We have copies of our medical summaries, our financial records, and our updated durable powers of attorney." Daniel started at her. "You updated what?" "Our legal documents," Martha said. After the house sale, Karen's expression hardened. "With whose help?" "Nora Fields referred us to an independent attorney in Millbridge. Daniel took a step forward. "Mom, you should have told us." Martha met his eyes. "You taught us not to." That landed harder than shouting would have. For the first time, Daniel looked away. But Karen did not. "This still doesn't change the fact that the dock may be unsafe and the canoe may not belong to you." A voice came from the shoreline. "Depends who wants it." Walter Briggs stood near the gravel path, leaning on his cane. Beside him was Nora Fields, the retired reporter, carrying a camera bag. Daniel muttered, "Great." Nora smiled politely. "I was invited." Martha nodded. "By me?" Denise's expression cooled. The room had changed again. There were witnesses now. Walter stepped onto the dock slowly and looked directly at Daniel. "I knew your grandparents," he said. "They would be ashamed of how this started." Daniel's face reddened. "You don't know anything about my family." "I know when children call control care," Walter said. Before Daniel could respond, a second car entered the clearing. This one belonged to the town. A man in a gray suit got out, followed by a younger inspector carrying a clipboard. Jake's shoulders tightened. The man in the suit smiled as if arriving by coincidence. "Harold Bennett?" Harold stepped forward. "That's me. Martin Voss, council chair." Martha felt Ruth's name from the records rise in her mind. Voss. Leonard Voss had been the banker Ruth accused of moving trust funds. Martin Voss extended his hand. Harold did not take it. Martin lowered it smoothly. "We received concerns about unauthorized occupancy, unsafe repairs, and improper handling of possible historical materials." "From whom?" Jake asked. Martin glanced at him. "Multiple citizens." Nora lifted her camera slightly. "On the record, Mr. Voss?" His smile thinned. "We're simply here to protect public interest." Martha looked at the man more carefully. He had Leonard Voss's last name. The same careful smile. The same instinct to make control sound civic. The inspector moved toward the bait office. Harold stepped in front of the door. "Not without written notice." Martin sighed softly. "Mr. Bennett, cooperation would make this easier." "For whom?" Harold asked. The question hung there. Then Martha lifted the account summary from the table. "Mr. Voss," she said, "are you related to Leonard Voss?" Martin's face did not change quickly enough. "My grandfather." Nora's camera clicked once. Martha nodded. "Then you may understand why we will be careful about who touches these records." For the first time, Martin's politeness cracked. "Mrs. Bennett, I would advise you not to make accusations you cannot prove." "We don't intend to," Martha said. "We intend to prove the ones already written down." Daniel looked between his mother and the council chair. Confusion crossed his face. Maybe, for the first time, he realized this was bigger than a strange canoe or an old dock. Martin turned to the inspector. "Post the notice." The inspector hesitated, then stapled a yellow sheet to the outer post near the entrance. "Temporary safety review. Public hearing scheduled Friday. Until review, no alteration or removal of historical material permitted." Karen looked satisfied. Denise looked cautious. Daniel looked uncertain. Harold read the notice twice. Martha stood beside him, holding the folder against her chest. They had been here before. A meeting arranged by others. Papers placed in front of them, concern used as a doorway to control. But this time, they were not sitting alone at a dining table. Jake stood behind them. Lily stood in the bait office doorway. Walter leaned on his cane near the rail. Nora lowered her camera and said, "I'll be there Friday." Martin Voss adjusted his coat. "I hope you understand, Mr. Bennett. This is not personal." Harold looked past him at the lake, then at the canoe resting in the light. "It usually is," he said. The officials left first. Daniel Linge. For a moment, he seemed about to speak as a son rather than an interested party. But Karen touched his arm. He followed her back to the car. When the clearing emptied, Lily walked to the yellow notice and read it silently. "Can they take this place?" she asked. Harold did not answer too quickly. Martha reached for his hand. "They can try," she said. Inside the bait office, the Welcome Home plaque hung beside the door. Below it, the yellow notice fluttered in the lake wind. One sign had been placed there by love, the other by power. By Friday, the whole town would have to decide which one mattered more. By Friday evening, the town hall was full. Harold and Martha arrived early. Jake carried copied documents. Lily carried photographs of the hidden compartment, the canoe, and the brass Callaway Lake Trust plate. Nora Fields sat near the front with a recorder. Walter Briggs took a chair by the aisle. Daniel and Karen sat 3 rows back. Daniel would not meet Harold's eyes. At the front, Martin Voss sat behind the council table with 2 other members and the county inspector. His face wore the same public calm he had brought to the dock. The hearing began with safety. The inspector listed concerns about railings, wiring, roof leaks, and occupancy. Some were fair. Harold knew that. The dock still needed work. Pretending otherwise would only weaken them. When asked to respond, Harold stood. He acknowledged each issue. Then he handed over dated photographs, receipts, repair notes, and Jake's written assessment. "We are not asking anyone to ignore safety," Harold said. "We are asking that safety not be used as an excuse to erase evidence." A murmur moved through the room. Martin leaned toward his microphone. "This hearing is not about old accusations. It is about current risk." Martha rose beside Harold. "Then we should discuss why the risk suddenly became urgent after the canoe was found." The room stirred again. Martha opened the first folder. She did not speak quickly. She had spent 40 years helping people find truth in paper, and she knew documents needed space. She showed the auction receipt proving Harold owned the dock structure. She showed photographs proving the canoe had been sealed inside a hidden compartment before they touched it. She showed the journal page where Elias Calloway wrote that if records were taken from his office, no one would think to search the canoe. Then she showed the account summary. 3 transfers. Same week. Different recipient names. One connected to a development firm later tied to Leonard Voss. Martin interrupted. "Mrs. Bennett, these are 50-year-old papers. You are implying criminal conduct by people no longer here to defend themselves." A voice came from the side aisle. "I am here." Everyone turned. An elderly woman stood in the doorway with a walker in front of her and Lily at her side. Ruth Ellison had insisted on coming. The room changed when she entered. Old teachers have a way of remaining in a town's memory. Ruth moved slowly to the microphone. Her hands shook. Her voice did not. "My name is Ruth Calloway Ellison. Elias Calloway was my brother." Martin looked down at his papers. Ruth looked directly at him. "Your grandfather called him unstable too." The silence sharpened. Ruth continued. "Elias created the Calloway Lake Trust so children without private docks could learn the water, so older fishermen wouldn't be pushed out, so the North Shore wouldn't become a line of gates." She opened a small envelope. "This is a letter he mailed to me 2 days before he vanished. I have kept it in my Bible for 54 years. Martha had not known about the letter. Ruth unfolded it and read only part. "If anything happens before the hearing, do not believe I left by choice. The canoe is safe. The records are safer than I am." No one spoke. Ruth placed the letter beside Martha's documents. "I was 26, she said. "People told me grief had confused me. They said Elias ran because he was ashamed. They said the trust failed because he stole from it." Her voice cracked once, then steadied. "But my brother built boats for children and fixed motors for widows who could not pay him. He did not steal from anyone." Walter Briggs stood next. "My father worked the lake that summer," Walter said. "He saw Elias meet with Leonard Voss near the North Dock the day before Elias disappeared. He told me never to repeat it because he had children to feed, and Voss controlled half the loans in town." Martin leaned forward. "This is hearsay." Nora spoke before Martha could. "It is testimony. Let him finish." The room murmured its approval. Walter lifted his cane slightly toward Martin. "Your grandfather scared people. Maybe that isn't your crime. But covering it now would be." For the first time, Daniel stood. Harold turned, surprised. Daniel looked pale. "I need to say something." Karen grabbed his sleeve, but he pulled free. "I contacted the attorney," he said. "I called about the dock. I thought my parents were making another emotional decision." His throat worked, and I told myself it was concern. "That's what I called it with the house too." Karen whispered his name sharply. Daniel ignored her, but after the blog post, Karen and I looked into whether the canoe might have value, historical value, maybe financial value. I told myself we needed to protect them. He looked at Harold and Martha. But that wasn't the whole truth. The room was painfully quiet. I was embarrassed when they bought the dock. Embarrassed that people were laughing. Embarrassed that my parents were living somewhere I thought made our family look bad. Martha's face tightened, but she did not look away. Daniel swallowed. "And I helped sell their home because it was easier to call it safety than admit I wanted the problem solved." Karen stood. "Daniel, stop." He finally turned to her. "No. One word. Small, late, but real. Martin Voss tried to regain control. This family matter is unfortunate, but it does not change the legal questions before us. Martha lifted the last document. No, but this does. It was a certified copy from the county archive, delivered that morning after Nora found a misfiled reference number in an old article. A shoreline access agreement signed in 1972. The North Dock had been pledged to the Callaway Lake Trust for public educational use if the trust remained active or if its original purpose could be restored by surviving trustees or heirs. Ruth placed her hand on the table. I am the surviving heir. The council attorney, silent until then, asked to examine the document. He read for nearly 2 minutes. Then he whispered to the council members. Martin's face slowly lost color. Martha spoke into the microphone. Harold and I are not asking to own history. We are asking to protect it. Let the dock be repaired under inspection. Let the canoe and records be preserved. Let Ruth's brother's name be restored. And let this place serve the purpose it was meant to serve before money buried it. Someone in the back began clapping. Then another. Then more. Martin struck the gavel twice, but the sound disappeared under the applause. The council recessed for 20 minutes. When they returned, the decision was careful but clear. The safety order would remain only as a supervised repair plan, not an eviction. The canoe and documents would stay protected under a temporary historical preservation agreement. A formal review would be opened into the Callaway Lake Trust, the shoreline access agreement, and the missing funds. Martin Voss did not look at Ruth when the decision was read. Ruth did not need him to. She had waited more than half a century for a room to hear her brother's name without shame attached to it. Outside Town Hall, people gathered under the streetlights. Some apologized to Harold and Martha for laughing. Some asked how they could help repair the dock. Daniel approached his parents alone. I'm sorry, he said. Harold looked at him. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they arrived too small for what had been broken. Martha answered first. Sorry is a door, Daniel. It is not the whole house. Daniel nodded, tears standing in his eyes. I know. No, Harold said quietly. You don't yet. But maybe you can learn. Daniel looked toward Ruth, then toward Lily, Jake, Walter, and the people offering help around them. For the first time, he seemed to understand that family was not a title kept by blood. It was a place earned by how you stood beside someone when they were easiest to dismiss. That night, Harold and Martha returned to the dock with the boxes of documents. The yellow notice still hung below the Welcome Home plaque. Harold removed it carefully, because even papers that hurt you could become proof that you survived. Then they stood together in the doorway, looking at the canoe resting beneath the warm lamp. The hearing had not fixed everything, but it had changed the direction of the wind, and for the first time in months, the lake did not sound like something they had lost. It sounded like something calling them forward. The first morning after the hearing, nobody arrived at the dock with threats. No yellow notice waited on the post. No black sedan sat near the gravel clearing. No one stood outside with a clipboard. Only the lake was there, gray-blue beneath the early sun. Quiet, patient. Harold woke before Martha and stepped outside, one hand against the doorframe. The Welcome Home plaque hung beside him, no longer leaning, no longer waiting for permission. Inside, Lily slept on a folding cot near the back wall. The canoe rested beneath the window, its cedar hull catching the first line of morning light. Harold had thought justice would feel louder. Instead, it felt like breath returning. The weeks that followed were full of real work. The county assigned a supervised repair schedule. Jake coordinated materials. A retired electrician donated 2 weekends. Mason, the quiet boy who had sanded cedar scraps, returned every Saturday and learned to varnish. The town that had laughed now brought tools. Harold accepted the help, but not the pity. There was a difference. Martha turned the bait office into a temporary archive. Ruth visited twice, sitting beside the canoe as if beside an old friend. The first time she touched the brass plate, she whispered her brother's name, Elias. Then she smiled. That smile did more than any apology could have done. It gave the past a witness. The historical review continued, and Martin Voss resigned from the council 2 weeks after the hearing. But Harold and Martha did not build their new life around his downfall. Their attention stayed on the dock, on the people who came, on what the place could become. The official name arrived almost by accident. One afternoon, Lily was painting a repaired doorframe when a woman arrived with her elderly father. The man had recently lost his apartment after medical bills swallowed his savings. He did not need a bed that day. He needed somewhere to sit where nobody made him feel like a burden. Martha made coffee. Harold pulled out a chair. Lily wrote his name on the visitor board. When the man left, he paused near the doorway and looked up at the plaque. "This place feels like a harbor," he said. Jake nodded toward Harold. "Then that's what it is." Martha added the word house. Harbor House. A month later, the name appeared on a hand-painted sign above the entrance. Harbor House did not become a shelter in the official sense. Not at first. It became something gentler and harder to categorize. A place where older people could get help reading difficult letters. A place where young people could learn small repairs. A place where Ruth's brother's Canoe taught children that history was not dead just because adults stopped speaking of it. A place where coffee was always available and no one had to apologize for needing a chair. Lily changed too. Not all at once. Healing rarely performs on schedule. Martha helped her enroll in community college classes online. Jake offered her part-time work at the hardware store. Harold taught her to restore a small rowboat donated by a retired fisherman. The first time Lily signed her name as assistant coordinator of Harbor House, she stared at the paper. "I've never had a title before," she said. Harold looked over his glasses. "Then spell it right." She laughed so hard Martha had to sit down. Daniel came every Thursday for 6 weeks before Harold let him carry more than coffee. At first, he stood awkwardly near the entrance. Karen never came. Eventually, Daniel admitted they had separated. Martha did not ask for details. Some consequences did not require witnesses. Daniel apologized more than once, but Harold stopped him after the third time. "Words are not lumber," Harold said. "You can't build with them unless something holds them in place." So Daniel showed up. He cleaned gutters. He drove Ruth to appointments. One evening, he stood outside with Martha as the sun lowered behind the lake. "I thought I was helping," he said. Martha watched the light move over the water. "No," she said gently. "You thought deciding was the same as helping." Daniel absorbed that without defending himself. That was the first useful thing he had done with guilt. Forgiveness did not arrive like a door swinging open. It arrived like weather. Some days clear, some days not. Harold and Martha allowed Daniel near their lives, but not at the center of their decisions. He had a key to the supply closet, not to their papers. He could repair a step, not rewrite their future. It was not punishment. It was a boundary. And boundaries, Martha often said, were another form of shelter. By summer, the dock looked transformed. The railings were sound. The bait office had been cleaned, painted, and lined with shelves. The canoe hung from ceiling supports in the main room. Beneath it stood a small plaque with Elias Calloway's name, Ruth's testimony, and one sentence from his journal. "No one will think to search the canoe." Visitors always read that line twice. On the evening of Harbor House's dedication, more people came than the dock could comfortably hold. Folding chairs lined the gravel. Children sat near the water. Ruth sat in the front with a blanket over her lap. Harold thanked the volunteers. He thanked Ruth for trusting them with her brother's truth. Then he looked toward Daniel, who stood near the back. "And I thank everyone who learned that concern without respect can become another kind of harm." Daniel lowered his eyes, but he did not leave. Martha spoke last. "A harbor is not a place where storms never come," she said. "It is a place built so people can survive them." When the ribbon was cut, Lily opened the door. Not Harold, not Martha, Lily. Because Harbor House was not only about what 2 old people had survived, it was about who would be welcomed next. Later, after the crowd thinned and the lake turned dark, Harold and Martha sat together near the rail. Warm light spilled from the bait office windows. Voices drifted inside. The canoe rested overhead, no longer hidden, no longer silent. Daniel approached slowly and stopped a few feet away. "May I sit?" he asked. Harold looked at Martha. Martha looked at the empty chair. "Tonight," she said, "you may sit." It was not everything, but it was a beginning. Across the room, Lily welcomed an elderly woman who had arrived late, carrying one suitcase and wearing the frightened look of someone trying not to need too much. Lily did not ask what had happened. She opened the door wider. Outside, the lake reflected every light from Harbor House in long golden lines. And the old dock, once bought for $7 because nobody else wanted it, held steady over the water, not as a place of last resort, Not as a mistake, but as a promise that no life becomes worthless simply because someone else stops seeing its value. And that sometimes the safest harbor is the one built by people who know what it means to be left out in the cold.